In today's lesson, we're going to talk about the useEffect hook. So useEffect is used in React and React Native if there are side effects that you want to happen within your app. So we already know that when you have a state variable, whenever that variable is updated or changed, the components depending upon it will re-render. Well, useEffect has a similar purpose, except it's it's definitely more powerful. So what this does is this allows you to say that I have a certain component or page that is dependent upon other variables, and those other variables have any changes, then I want to run the code that is inside the useEffect. So you can use this for two reasons. First of all, you can use this if you have certain actions that need to be performed when the component mounts or loads, or if you have certain actions that need to happen if a variable value changes, then you would also run the useEffect. So in the example that I have provided today, we are going to take a look at using this simple API. And typically when you work with an API, the data that is returned will be in JSON form. And so if you haven't worked with JSON form before, this is an example of what you will see. So it is a collection of objects, and you should notice that this syntax here is somewhat similar to what we see when we look at the style sheet objects, where we have on the style sheets, we have a property and then we have a value. Well, a JSON object is essentially a key value pair. So the key is ID and 1 is the value. The key is name, Leanne Graham is the value, and so on. Then we have some objects within the object. So for example, address. Since these are all components of an address, they are all included under the address object. So name, username, email, those are just one value, one key, one value. But for things like address or company, address is a key, and then within there we have these subkeys, so to speak. So I would refer to them as address.street and address.suite, and so forth. Now within your app, you're going to create an interface. Now an interface is a lot like a type, which we've been using for our prop types. The difference is that interfaces are considered better to use for best practice for working with an API, and they are easier to extend, and so there are a lot of reasons why this is better that we haven't quite taught yet in our class, but for right now, just know that you could also use a type. For our purposes, they're going to look the same, but it is typically recommended to use an interface when you are dealing with an API. So essentially what's going to happen is I'm going to make a request to this API. Whenever I click a button, I'm going to request that data from that API. And this is going to be the response that's going to come. Now you might say, well, I don't need to know the Latin long. I don't need all that information. And that's fine. And so that's where in your interface, you define which pieces you do want. So we say, I want the ID and I want the name. If later you decide you also want email, we just add another value to our interface. And then what's going to happen is we're going to query the API. It'll get this object. We are going to wait for its response. When we get a response, we are going to assign the response into a user variable. And what it will do is it will simply take the values that we need and put them into ID and name. And then now, because that variable has changed using a useEffect, any screen that depended on that value will now be updated. So a couple more things we're going to come back to, but before we do that, I just want to show you how the app runs and then show you the code. So I have my emulator launched, and you can see right here, I've already launched it, and I'm on user ID 3. If I click reload, now I have 4, and so on. And you can see it's pretty fast. There's actually a loading icon that would appear here in between the loading, but it's so fast you don't even see it. So this right here, this is just data that I'm getting. And you can see now that I've reached the end of the list of data that was on that website. That's why it's no longer filling anything in. If I were to go ahead and I were to reload my app, we will now see, I guess I have to restart it. Hold on, let me restart the app so you can see how it looks from the beginning when my launching icon or my activity indicator is a little bit faster. So I'm going to cancel this. I'm going to restart it. And then I'm going to launch it in Android. There we go. All right, so right now I'm restarting my app, and I'm going to press R to force it to reload. And for some reason, it doesn't want to reload for me. You know what? We're just going to keep on going to the code. These emulators are really finicky. All right, so if we go back to the code, I don't know why that's not restarting properly, but we'll get there. Let's look at the code here. So for starters, I'm in my main index page, and I'm using the activity indicator here. So that's a new component we're going to talk about. And so here I'm defining the data that I want to fetch. Again, we can add more fields here if we deem necessary. Next, I have some state variables. So first, I have a state variable for my user for whether or not I'm still loading data, if I had any error, and then what the user ID is. I'm going to start with ID 1 because that was the first ID in that data set. Now from here, I want you to notice that we have this user or null. And essentially what that's saying is that this variable type for the state will be of type user. However, if I don't have a user, then it can be of type null, and my starting value is null. This is something that we do often for safety to make sure that our variable value always has a value, because when the app first loads, I don't have a user to put there. And so that's how I can have my starting value. When I start the app, I am loading. That's why this starts as true. And then the same reason why I have a null for my user, I have a null for my error, because hopefully I don't have an error. But if I do, I will put it there. All right, so now I have this useEffect. And in my useEffect, we're going to see something called an asynchronous function. And asynchronous just means it happens in the background. It means that we have our tasks of things that we're doing, and then these are things that are happening in the background. So in the background, while I am fetching data, I am loading. That's why that's true. I have no error that I know of. And then I'm going to try the following. Now, we learned about try catches in Java, so hopefully you're familiar with this. Essentially what our try catch is doing is it is saying that I want to try to do a task, and then if I have an issue, I will deal with it. So I'm going to try to get this data. Again, I'm using something called an await. So here, when I say that this is asynchronous, that means that there is an asynchronous task that is happening in the background. And what this is telling me to do is to wait while I fetch the data. So again, that's this asynchronous task. It's happening in the background. I'm going to this website, and this is how I can get a placeholder that will allow it to update with different user IDs as I click the button more and more. And then I'm saying, okay, wait for that response. And so what's going to happen here is I'm going to go to this website. I'm going to get the response as a JSON object, and then I'm going to store it into the variable data that is of my type user. And then once I've gotten that value, I'm going to set the user to update its data. And if I happen to have an error, I'm going to set my error. And then finally is saying, once you have finished either getting the user or getting the error, set loading to false so that I know I'm done with my task. And so what this code is telling me to do is in my useEffect, I'm going to do all of these things. And then this part right here in the brackets, this is what's called an dependency array. So this is telling me that my useEffect depends upon the value of user ID. So whenever user ID changes, I need to call this code. And if I had code that was only going to run once at startup, then I would have an empty array here, and that's how React knows that I only want to run this once. Now, inside my actual return statement, I see something else we haven't seen before, which is a conditional component loading. So I'm essentially saying loading. So if loading is true, then I want to show my activity indicator. Else, if it's not loading and there is an error, I want to show the text of the error. Else, if there is no error and it's no longer loading, I want to display the actual text on the screen. So I have essentially a conditional rendering, and then within there, I have another one. So this is like a nested if statement. And then finally, I have this button, and if they press to reload, it's going to update my user ID to be sending it the previous ID +1. And that's all that's going on here. Let's say I wanted to add another field. I could do so by adding another value to my interface definition. So let's say I wanted to add email. And then I wanted to add the text right here. And we'll say email. And then here, I'm going to say email. And then if I save this and then go back, and let's try and do a reload. I don't know why it is not reloading. All right, well, I guess I'm going to have to relaunch my emulator. Take my word for it. It works, I promise. And so from here, let's just take a look back at the useEffect. All right, I decided to relaunch my emulator real quick. So we're going to see if this is going to force it to reload. And oh my gosh, no, it's not doing it. Oh, there we go. No. Okay, well, anyway, I just want to continue talking about the different information that we're learning here in the notes. So our key points. So we use our state to manage these different data values like we talked about before. The hook is going to fetch the data when the component mounts or loads. If we have an empty array, that means that it only runs once when the component first starts. If there are values in there, then it will run whenever those are updated. Error handling. We haven't used this yet in this course, but we should always add error handling, especially if we're dealing with asynchronous functions like data fetching. And I'm using this activity indicator so that way it'll be showing as those values are loading. And then last, I have this conditional component display. So this is only going to display if is loading is true. And we actually nested those conditional displays so that way I could have the effect of an if, else, and then within the else, an if, else. The website that I used to generate this code is this one right here, jasonplaceholder.typeofcode.com/users. And then the way that you get a specific data is user/1, user/2, and so forth. And last but not least, this is the complete code that I had put in my file that I was loading and showing you. All right, well, I hope this was helpful learning how to use the useEffect hook.